Is America a Christian nation? Of course, there are a lot of people who insist that it is. Like television preacher and politician Pat Robertson, who tells millions of his listeners, there is no such thing as separation of church and state in the Constitution. It is a lie of the left, and we're not going to take it anymore. We've heard that so many times, in so many venues, that many Americans, perhaps most, have come to accept the idea of a Christian nation as fact when, in fact, it is not. Most of those many Americans don't have an agenda behind their belief in the Christian nation notion. Most simply don't understand why they can't have organized prayer in schools and Christmas creches in town halls. But many are Christian Reconstructionists and other fundamentalists whose goal is nothing less than an American Taliban, like Randall Terry of Operation Rescue, who has announced, our goal is a Christian nation. We have a biblical duty. We are called by God to conquer this country. Now, if conquering the nation for God is your goal, then there's nothing really wrong with a little fudging of history to serve the cause, is there? You can put words in the mouths of presidents long dead, ignore facts that don't fit your agenda, and make up facts that do. Whatever their motives, however they reconstruct history to fit their biases, the claim that America is or was a Christian nation is based on 5 arguments. 1, that America was settled by Christians, most famously the Pilgrim Fathers, who braved the wilderness to find a place where they could worship freely. 2, that from the earliest days Americans were, and still are, overwhelmingly Christian, and that the will of the people was then, and is now, to have their government reflect their Christian beliefs. 3, that the Founding Fathers were Christians whose intention it was to create a Christian nation. 4, that our founding documents, from the Mayflower Compact to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution itself, are based on biblical law and Christian principles. And 5, that it is only in recent years that our Christian heritage has been attacked and subverted by liberals and secular humanists. Okay. Okay, let's examine these in historical order. First, that America was settled by Christians. Of course it was, but let's remember that the so-called Christian pilgrims were not the first to land here. The first colony of English-speaking Europeans was at Jamestown, Virginia, settled in 1607 for trade and to exploit the wealth they expected to find, including, quote, gold, silver, and copper, unquote, in the words of the first charter of Virginia, not for religious freedom. So, naturally, Jamestown quickly became a magnet for such venture capitalists as pirates, gamblers, and other swashbucklers, not pious Christians. And in 1619, a year before the Mayflower landed up north in Massachusetts, the colony of Jamestown took delivery of Virginia's first 20 African slaves. And surprise, some of those Africans were Muslims. So, before the pious Puritans, America was settled and unsettled by pirates, hustlers, slaves, and Muslims. In November 1620, hundreds of miles to the north, the Mayflower arrived offshore from what would become Massachusetts with 102 people aboard. Contrary to popular misconception, those 102 were not all Puritans. In fact, only 37 of them were. The rest were a mixed bag who shared one thing in common, a deep mistrust and suspicion of the 37 Puritans. Why? Let's clear up a little misconception about why those Puritans were here, going to a wilderness, an ocean away from the civilization of their times. To practice their religion in freedom? Yes. But they were already doing that in the Netherlands. They had left England and the persecution of the Church of England several years before, and intolerant, secular Holland were practicing freely. But what they really wanted was to establish their own theocracy and to take their children, who were naturally fraternizing with Dutch kids, away from the contamination of ideas that were other than pure. So they left New Netherlands, where they could worship exactly as they wanted, for the New World. The Mayflower was supposed to have landed in Virginia, not New England, but had been blown off course, and many of the other passengers suspected that the Puritans had connived with the Mayflower crew to take them as far away from Virginia and the Virginia colony and its Church of England authority as possible. And so was conceived the Mayflower Compact. To explain, Puritans believed a few things that had important effects on the subsequent history of this country. First was their belief that early Christian congregations in the New Testament era ran their own affairs and were subject to no higher supervision than that of Christ himself. Emulating those early congregations was a return to pure Christianity for the Bible-literate Puritans, hence the name Puritans, and the name Congregational, by which their churches became known. The Puritans also believed, like the biblical Hebrews, that they had a covenant with God, and that covenants between men to govern themselves justly were a reflection of that even more important covenant. So, they drew up and signed an agreement while at anchor off Plymouth to, quote, enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unquote, and to govern themselves by majority rule. While the history books have rightly emphasized the revolutionary importance of this first ever known example of free men consciously creating a community and its government of laws by which they would live, an equally important point was that the Puritans invited the other men on the Mayflower to sign on too as equal partners. 4 of them did, and some basic trust among the colonies was restored. But let's face it, the Puritans were religious fanatics who believed that everyone who did not believe as they did was not only doomed to eternal hellfire, but was an agent of Satan. And so the history of that little colony of believers up to the Salem witch trials in 1692 and beyond is a chronology of fanatic Christian fundamentalism gone wild. In 1630, 900 more Puritans immigrated to Massachusetts Bay, led by John Winthrop, who became the colony's first governor. That year, now that they were the overwhelming majority, they began using tax money to support ministers of the Congregationalist Church. In 1631, they restricted the vote to members of the church. By 1635, non-members were taxed, like it or not, to, quote, pay for the preaching that might lead ultimately to their conversion, unquote. And although the Massachusetts General Court did not pass a law proposed by one of the colony's founding fathers that would have required women to wear veils, dissenters like Quakers were publicly whipped for their heresies. And in 1646, the court did make religious heresy punishable by death. So much for the Mayflower Compact. Today's historical revisionists often argue that the Mayflower Compact certainly did establish the Christian religion in the new land. So it did. But it also reaffirmed the Puritans' loyalty to the King of England. If the compact makes the argument for a Christian nation, it also makes the argument against the American Revolution. In fact, if America was biblically based, there would be no United States of America, because the New Testament specifically admonishes Christians to, quote, accept authority in 1 Peter 2:13. And in Romans 13, it warns that, quote, those who resist authority will incur judgment, unquote. So much for a revolution to overthrow the authority of the king. Of course, there was dissent in New England. In 1636, Roger Williams, who had been banished from Massachusetts for new and dangerous opinions, like religious and political freedom, including separation of church and state, founded Providence and Rhode Island, which became havens for religious dissenters. And in 1638, Anne Hutchinson, also banished from Massachusetts for nonconformist religious views, moved her family to Rhode Island, establishing their own colony there. In the Rhode Island Compact signed by the men of her family in 1638, one of the first rules was, no person within said colony at any time hereafter shall be in any wise molested, punished, disquieted, or called into question on matters of religion, so long as he keeps the peace. By the way, the heresy trial that resulted in Hathaway's banishment from Massachusetts is a perfect example of Christian self-righteousness run amok. Governor Winthrop, frustrated by Hutchinson winning every debating point, simply ordered her banished. I desire to know wherefore I am banished, she asked. Say no more, Winthrop answered. The court knows and is satisfied. Which reminds me of the great title of a Ring Lardner short story. Shut up, he explained. And which brings us to argument 2, that the early settlers of America were almost all Christians who wanted their government to reflect their religious beliefs. Well, yes and no. By 1700, Congregationalism, based on Puritan principles, was the established religion of almost all of New England, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, whose code, Connecticut's Code of 1650, ordained, quote, if any man shall have or worship any god but the Lord God, he shall be put to death, unquote. In the South, following its establishment in Virginia, the Church of England, known as the Anglican Church in America, became the established church of all the southern colonies. By 1770, on the eve of the Revolution, the Anglican Church reigned in Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Reigned, but did not always rule. In fact, throughout the colonies, the established churches ruled in cities and towns, collected their support money from the local governments, ran their schools and their charities, but had little effect or influence in the rural and mountain areas, where the Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s had converted so many to the new Baptist and Methodist churches. In the middle colonies, the picture is very different. The Anglican Church was the established church in New York and had been since the British took the colony from the far more tolerant Dutch in 1664. But that meant little outside New York City and Westchester County, where Anglicanism was the religion of the ruling elite. During Dutch rule, New York, then New Netherlands, had been the scene of one of the great advances in his history of the New Netherlands colony, the island at the center of the world. English Quakers drove Governor Peter Stuyvesant nuts, quote, with their sermonizing and taunting and the juggling fits of spiritual frenzy for which they were named. They were, in his estimation, a threat to the peace and stability of the colony, and probably out of their minds as well. When Stuyvesant forbade the town of Vlissingen, which today we call Flushing, from abetting the Shakers in their defiance of the Dutch Reformed Church, 31 of the villagers signed a remonstrance to Stuyvesant. The law of love, peace, and liberty, they reminded him, extends even to Jews, Turks, and Egyptians. Therefore, they respectfully refused to obey. And the tolerant Dutch government back in European Amsterdam backed them up, which really drove Pegleg Stuyvesant crazy. The Flushing Remonstrance is not as well known as the Mayflower Compact, but it is even more fundamental to American liberty, a true ancestor to the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. New Jersey, by the way, which shared the same Dutch to English history as New York, also became a religious free market. In Pennsylvania, still in the middle colonies, Philadelphia was the second largest city in the British Empire by 1770. Only London was bigger, and was home to every religion known to Western civilization. And the colony remained true to its Quakers founders' ideal of religious tolerance. So did little Delaware across the river, which pretty much did whatever Pennsylvania did. So, look at the scorecard in 1770 on the eve of the Revolution. Of the 13 colonies, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut had Congregationalist establishments with sometimes brutally restrictive religious laws going back to Puritan days. 6 had established the mother country's Anglican Church, but the church really held sway only in the established towns. 4 colonies, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, had no established Christian church at all. In fact, most of the new breed of people being called Americans were not much interested in organized church-affiliated religion. While most would call themselves Christian, that title in the 18th century would have meant pretty much the same thing as today saying American or European or not a barbarian. Okay? According to 2 of the most distinguished American historians of the 20th century, Richard Hofstadter and James McGregor Burns, names I'm sure many of you are familiar with, by 1790, as many as 90% of Americans were not members of any church. So, was America a Christian nation at the time of the founding? Yes, in the sense that most Americans considered themselves Christian, but not very. But what about the third argument? That the founding fathers who actually wrote the documents that created the new nation were believing Christians hell-bent on creating a Christian nation. Let's look at the beliefs and practices of perhaps the most important 5 of those founders. The first 4 presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, and the man some historians have called the first American, Benjamin Franklin. Lighthouses are more helpful than churches, said Franklin, the man who discovered electricity and invented the lightning rod. That invention, by the way, caused Ben some grief. Clergymen throughout the colonies actually condemned Franklin's invention because, they said, lightning rods thwarted the will of God, whose divine prerogative it was, presumably, to destroy houses with lightning bolts. As Franklin answers, don't roofs on houses thwart God's reign? Franklin was a scientist, a rationalist, and a deist who helped write the Declaration of Independence, presided over the Congress that approved it, and participated in the writing of the new Constitution. He had little use for Christianity. I have found Christian dogma unintelligible, he wrote. Early in life, I absented myself from Christian assemblies. Like many others, Franklin did believe that most people, himself not included, needed religion to keep them in line. But was he a Christian? Not even a little bit. We shouldn't really have to even discuss the religious disbelief of that acknowledged freethinker Thomas Jefferson. But because of the revisionists, let's do. Jefferson wrote most of the Declaration of Independence, which has been called America's birth certificate. And the revisionists claim that the handiwork of his is chock full of references to God, from the law of nature and nature's God, and of men who have been created equal with inalienable rights, endowed by their creator, to all the way to the signer's own reliance on divine providence and their pledge of their sacred honor. Well, actually, that's it. 5 words or phrases. No Jesus, no Savior, no Messiah, no Christian imagery at all. But, says legal scholar Alan Dershowitz, the Christian historical revisionists want to use those few words to turn America's birth certificate into a baptismal certificate. In fact, those 5 words are all typical deist formulations, expressions of a benign but uninvolved deity who kick-started the universe. Somebody or something had to, most everyone then supposed, and then left it and us on our own to work out our own destinies. Deism was the product of the English and French Enlightenment that swept through the colleges of America in the 1750s and 60s, when Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and others of the founders were attending college and forming their own ideas and philosophies. Some deists inclined to a rationalistic Christianity, some to materialistic disbelief. But most of them tried to construct a natural religion by the light of reason, totally discrediting revelation, miracles, and the supernatural. Using reason as a guide, Jefferson went through the New Testament painstakingly, literally scissoring out every reference to Jesus' purported miracles and any other supernatural event. His edited Bible, quote unquote, ended with the death of Jesus, a moral teacher whom Jefferson much admired. Jefferson's deistic version of the New Testament, titled The Life and Morals of Jesus, was meant to be read by his friends and was not published until nearly a century after his death. But that hasn't stopped the revisionists from actually peddling the idea that not only was Jefferson a Christian, but that he published his own Bible. The Jefferson Bible. And of course, to peddle that nonsense to thousands of readers of suckers through today's social media. Surely, the best known of all Jefferson quotes is, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." It's carved in stone on the Jefferson Monument. The revisionists have hijacked that too, because of that 3-letter noun with a capital G. But most people who have heard or read that quote don't know its context. Here's the whole quote. The clergy believed, when he was president, the clergy believe that any portion of power confided to me as president will be exerted in opposition to their schemes. And they believe rightly, for I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. But this is all they have to fear from me, and enough too, in their opinion, unquote. Jefferson was talking about Christian religious tyranny. The first time Jefferson used the wall of separation phrase was in his famous letter to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptists in 1802 while he was president. Again, context is important. The Baptists had written to President Jefferson because they wanted relief from what they call the oppression of the established Congregationalist Church of Connecticut, the inheritors of the Puritan Taliban. The Wall letter was Jefferson's answer to them. Quote, "Believing with you," he wrote, "that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and God, I contemplate with solemn reverence that act of the whole people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." Pretty good answer, and one that has been quoted in several Supreme Court decisions in the 200 years since. Separation of church and state, thank you, Thomas Jefferson. John Adams was a believing Unitarian Christian and active, along with his wife Abigail, in promoting Unitarianism. Unitarianism, which the Adamses called liberal Christianity, denied the Trinity as contrary to logic and reason, a denial that could have gotten John and Abigail hanged in Massachusetts a century earlier. Adams knew the history of intolerant, oppressive religion in his own state and region and wanted no part of a Christian establishment in his new nation. About that new country and its revolutionary concept of government, Adams wrote, "The question before the human race is whether the God of nature shall govern the world by his own laws or whether priests and kings shall rule it by fictitious miracles." Was Adams a Christian founder of the nation? Yes. A founder of a Christian nation? Absolutely not. Okay, pop quiz. Who said this? During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What has been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution, unquote. That's the fourth president of the United States, James Madison, who was especially important to the founding of the nation as one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 long, detailed newspaper articles that convinced the American public to support the new Constitution and in which the word God appears exactly twice. And both times, Gore Vidal said, in the sense of God only knows. Ignoring the fact that Madison became more and more a deist as he matured, and a Unitarian through his friendship with the Adamses, today's revisionists have loudly proclaimed Madison's Christian faith and practice in his youth. It's true. Madison came home to Virginia from the College of New Jersey, which we now call Princeton. He came back as an Orthodox Christian. But almost immediately, David Holmes says in Faiths of the Founding Fathers, Madison witnessed the persecution and jailing of religious dissenters by the established church, his church. At the age of 22, Madison became a convert to religious freedom. When Virginia adopted a new constitution in 1776, Madison insisted that it guarantee freedom of conscience rather than mere toleration. And in 1785, he wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, which advanced 15 arguments why government should not support religion, and which was the precursor to the Constitution's First Amendment. And finally, let's turn our attention to the big guy, the founding father himself, Washington. Listen to one of today's leading fake history revisionists, Tim LaHaye. You've all heard of the Left Behind series of books. Tim LaHaye said, were George Washington living today, he would fully identify with the Bible-believing brand of Christianity that is having such a positive influence on our nation. The utter bald-faced mendacity of that statement is breathtaking. Washington was a deist and a Freemason. In the thousands of his speeches, proclamations, private and public letters, and private conversations that have been recorded, the words Jesus Christ never appear in the sense of belief, not once. George Washington was not a Christian in any accepted sense of the word. But what about that iconic image of Washington kneeling in the snow of Valley Forge to pray for guidance from God? An image that Ronald Reagan called the most sublime picture in American history. George Washington on his knees in the snow at Valley Forge.
Yeah, it was a good photograph.
It's not even a half-truth. It's simply baloney. All the paintings, the etchings, the woodcuts, the two-penny stamp were all done decades after Washington's death by men who had never even seen him. So where did they get their idea? From the totally fabricated and best-selling Life of Washington, written and rushed into print by Mason Locke Weems in 1800. That's the same Parson Weems who gave us the famous tale of the hatchet and the cherry tree, featuring an insufferable, priggish little George telling his father, "I cannot tell a lie, I did it with my little hatchet." And ever after, millions of American school children who were fed that story thought, Jesus, what a little creep. But even if Weems made it up, isn't it possible that Washington did kneel in the snow and slush of Valley Forge every day to get divine guidance? No, not possible, because in keeping with his non-beliefs as a deist and his practices as a Freemason, he did not kneel in church or anywhere else. Masons don't kneel, period. There are dozens of eyewitness accounts that testify to his upright position in church while most of the congregates knelt. Where else did he not kneel? In the army, at Valley Forge, or anywhere else. Parson Weems made up his story of Washington in the snow, complete with detailed eyewitness accounts that turned out to be utterly bogus. He made them up and was either ignorant of or ignored a fact of 18th century military life. Washington was commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Army, the Continental Army, and would be senior to any chaplain conducting any service. According to military protocol of the time, the senior officer at any event, religious or otherwise, did not kneel. That was military protocol. Senior officer does not kneel, and he was the most senior officer of all. At home, Washington attended church with Martha because, one, it was a small favor he could do for his wife, and two, it was part of the established social routine of an 18th century Virginia gentleman. The noblesse oblige of setting a good example for the community. But Episcopal services in those days included a communion service for the devout, usually held one Sunday a month after the regular service. It is a matter of more than one record that Washington, along with other deists and Masons, always left church before the communion service. Yes, he was a vestryman of his local Episcopal church at Mount Vernon, as was deist Jefferson at Monticello, and probably Madison and Monroe at their homes in Virginia as well. But that too, being a vestryman, was a gentleman's obligation in the days when local churches, not any government, ran the schools and charities supervised by the vestryman. The vestry at the time was also the local court. So being a vestryman was an obligation no man in political life could ignore. Not being a vestryman in 18th century America would have been like not contributing to charity today, really bad manners and political suicide. Because he was an intensely private man who kept his personal opinions very much to himself, he has come down to us as the great stone face of the early history. But Washington, a Freemason and deist, a man of the Enlightenment, who forbade priests or prayers at his deathbed, where he calmly measured his own pulse as he died. He was no evangelical Christian. So, let's look at the Constitution the founders wrote and the government they created when they assembled in Philadelphia in 1787. Was it, as the revisionist fourth argument would have it, based on Christian principles, on biblical law? The revisionists would have us believe so, but it just is not so. To begin with, famously, the Constitution begins with the words, "We, the people of the United States of America." There is no invocation of God, no claim of a divine sanction, no appeal to heaven or Jesus or God or the Father for guidance, no mention even of the deistic providence that had appeared in the Declaration, not even an appeal to natural law, in spite of what Justice Scalia says over and over and over. On whose authority does the founding document of our nation depend? We, the people. Not only is the Constitution the first political charter in the history of Western civilization to omit the words God and Jesus Christ, but the United States was the first Western nation to omit Christian symbolism, the cross, from its flag and its currency, while Masonic symbols adorn our currency. The seeing eye and the pyramid, all of that, all Masonic. Religion is mentioned once in the Constitution in Article 6, Section 3, which says that federal elective and appointed officials shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. Those two words, or affirmation, meant that no office holder would ever be required to swear his loyalty on a Bible, and that is huge. Article 6 then concludes with, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." When some clergymen complained to Washington that what was being called our Magna Carta had no mention of Jesus, he offered a First Amendment argument even before that amendment was written. "I am persuaded," he wrote, "that the path of true piety is so plain as to require but little political direction. To this consideration we ought to ascribe the absence of any regulation respecting religion from the Magna Carta of our country." Alexander Hamilton put it even more plainly. When he was asked why the Constitution made no mention of God, he wisecracked, "We forgot." They didn't forget. They gave a lot of thought to religion during those closed-door deliberations in Philadelphia, and the sense of the overwhelming majority of the delegates, many of whom were believers, some of whom were clergy, was that they wanted no part of establishing any religion in the new Magna Carta. Good thinking. But what about that presidential oath of office, which is in the Constitution and which concludes with, "Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God"? Well, it's true. The presidential oath is in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Paragraph 9. But it does not include the words, "so help me God." Well, some of the innocents claim the words may not exactly be in the Constitution, but Washington added them at his first inauguration and kissed the Bible too. What's more, every president has carried on the tradition and said, "so help me God." No, Washington did not, and all the other presidents have not. There are dozens of eyewitness accounts both of Washington's inauguration, and not one of them mentions "so help me God." Not one. And by the way, he used a Masonic Bible, not a standard Christian one. But what about all the other presidents? Again, inaugurations were reported widely and in detail from the beginning of the Republic, and there is not a single mention of an added "so help me God" until the first inauguration of Chester Alan Arthur in 1881, 82 years and 20 presidents after Washington. And most of the oath-takings ever since have not included those words that are not in the Constitution. Teddy Roosevelt did not say them. Taft didn't. Wilson didn't. Coolidge and Hoover didn't. Franklin Roosevelt didn't 3 times out of 4. Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon did not say them. "So help me God" is not in any American oath of office. Religion is mentioned in the Constitution most famously not in the basic document itself, but in the First Amendment, which begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Freedom of religion was the first guarantee, thank you, the first words of the First Amendment. The founding era, that period between the winning of the war for independence in 1783 and through the first administrations presided over by presidents who had led the revolution, was perhaps the headiest, most exciting time in American history for freethinkers. It was certainly the most secular. The revisionists' fifth argument that secularism, liberalism, and humanism are modern heresies in America just doesn't jive with the facts of our nation's early history. As Susan Jacoby writes of that era in Freethinkers, quote, "What is striking from a 21st century perspective is the speed with which many Americans came to support a freedom of thought and religious practice that overturned millennia of religious authoritarianism. Even when legal barriers to full civic equality may remain, as they did for Jews in most states, the first 8 years of the American Republic were characterized by a de facto expansion of liberty for non-believers, as well as for dissident religious believers, for non-Christians and Christians alike. Secularism was in the air, no matter what the revisionists would have us believe. Americans took the new separation of church and state as the natural order of things. One after another, the states began disestablishing religions as they replaced their colonial charters with new constitutions. The post office and other government offices were open and working on Sundays. Tom Paine's Age of Reason was a bestseller, and Americans twice elected the so-called atheist Jefferson to the presidency. How secular was the new United States of America? The best answer lies in the wording of a document approved by 3 presidents and unanimously endorsed by the U.S. Senate. It needs to be much more widely publicized by American rationalists and freethinkers, although I assume a number of people here know it. 218 years ago, the United States was having a problem with an Arab Muslim state. Some things never change. The problem was that Barbary pirates who owed allegiance to the Bashaw of Tripoli were hijacking American ships and enslaving American sailors. The Quran allowed him to do this, the Bashaw said, because America was a Christian nation, and therefore the sailors were infidels who could and should be enslaved. In 1796 alone, 119 American sailors had been captured and enslaved. The United States was only a few years old in 1796, and certainly no great sea power. So the Washington administration diffused a bad situation by using diplomacy. What a nice idea. While beginning to build an American Navy. On November 4th, 1796, Joel Barlow, the American consul to the Barbary States, signed a treaty of peace and friendship with Tripoli. We paid a huge ransom, but we got back all our sailors except the 31 who died in captivity, and the pirates left American shipping alone for a few years. What was significant about that treaty? As Article 11 begins, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, etc., etc., no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. Not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Those words are in a treaty written during the Washington administration. He saw it and approved it, while Jefferson was Secretary of State. The treaty was endorsed and signed the next year by the new president, John Adams, after being approved unanimously by the U.S. Senate on June 7, 1797. Of course, the Bashaw reneged on the treaty, and another was signed a few years later. and the Bashaw reneged again. So we went to war during the Jefferson administration, and again in 1815 when President James Madison got really serious and sent the brand new Marine Corps to put the Barbary pirates out of action, you know, to the shores of Tripoli, led by John Wayne, of course. But the Treaty of Peace and Friendship with Tripoli, signed 218 years ago, has never been abrogated by the United States, not a Christian nation. Naturally, many clergymen howled about this not a Christian nation treaty in 1797 and for years afterwards. But during those heady, secular first few decades of the new republic, most of the public and most of its leaders were too committed to the idea of separation to pay the clerics much mind. Things would begin to change when the Second Great Awakening ignited evangelical fervor across the nation in the 1830s and 40s. But for a while, secularism ruled in America. In fact, in 1831, while Andrew Jackson was in office, the Reverend Dr. Bird Wilson, an Episcopal minister and a serious historian, who interviewed and took testimony from many survivors of the Revolutionary and founding eras, ruefully concluded, "The founders of our nation were nearly all infidels, and of the presidents who have thus far been elected, not a one has professed a belief in Christianity. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams, Jackson, not one Christian." Dr. Wilson wouldn't have been too happy with many of the presidents who followed either. Nearly every one, with one recent exception, is on record in favor of separation of church and state. Many of them didn't just favor it, they fought for it. And the 27th president, get this one, William Howard Taft, a man I admire for his girth as much as for his principles, declined the presidency of Yale after his term in office, writing, "I do not believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ." Wow. Imagine what the Republicans could do with that in a 30-second spot. Wait, Taft was a Republican, which is much to the point. Until very recently in our country's history, the commitment to church-state separation was a nonpartisan standard. From the Federalist and Democratic Republicans of the earliest years to the pre-Civil War Whigs, to the Republicans and Democrats of the 19th and 20th centuries, and including almost all the third parties and minor parties, American politics has steered clear of religion. Behind Jefferson's wall of separation, America has become the most Christian of all Western nations, with greater levels of church attendance, church membership, and belief in the Bible than any other country in the world. So you would think that the revisionists and our Christian Taliban would get the message. Church-state separation is good for them, but they don't. And while government in America has historically stayed out of religion, Christian fundamentalists from the first have campaigned to overturn the Constitution and the First Amendment, which has empowered them. They tried during the darkest days of the Civil War to get a frightened Congress and an unpopular president to pass an amendment to the preamble to the Constitution, substituting Jesus' authority for that of we the people. But Lincoln pigeonholed it. They have tried it again and again, even as recently as the 1950s. But while they haven't changed the Constitution, they have bullied spineless politicians into adding "in God we trust" on our currency and "under God" to our oath of allegiance. They've staged prayer breakfasts in the White House and diverted billions of our dollars, tax dollars, to faith-based initiatives. Candidates in Republican primaries all across America and Democrats in some rural and southern areas now regularly swear, often hypocritically, that they will support clearly unconstitutional legislation to put, quote, put prayer back in schools, to fund religious schools with public money, and to post the Ten Commandments in courthouses and public buildings. But we do, in fact, have a constitution, one written by intelligent, far-thinking secularists who knew exactly what they were doing, which guarantees the separation of church and state. And the American citizenry, through their political thinking, may swing right and left and back again. They're essentially a pragmatic bunch, and they know the Constitution they have serves them very, very well. The Declaration and the Constitution remain. They can sometimes be ignored by the fabricators and fakers, but they cannot be airbrushed away, and they will not be forgotten. Anne Hutchinson and Thomas Jefferson lived, and their ideas will prevail. Because, thanks to the foresight of the founders and the abiding good sense of its citizens, even most of its Christian citizens, the United States is not a Christian nation. It is a free nation. Thank you. Q&A? Do we do Q&A? Questions?
Thank you
Yes,
so
ma'am.
much. So where does our state of affairs today lie regarding separation of church and state? In other words, what are the challenges that have been in recent years that have challenged our First Amendment right of separation of church and state? Where are the battles being fought?
The problem is not in rooms like this, where people are aware of what's going on. What I alluded to at the beginning of the talk is that most people who think that, it's perfectly okay to have faith-based initiatives, to correct faith-based and community-based, blah, 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 is because they just want to put, why can't the kids learn about the Bible in school? Why can't we have a Christmas creche in the front of City Hall? Why can't we have the Ten Commandments in the courtroom? They don't think it through any further than that. They're reacting to their own, I don't want to say simple-minded, and I don't mean simple-minded, but their own simple concept of what Christianity or what religion means. They think that, like Ben Franklin, most people need it. We need this. We need to have religion to back us up. That's our problem, that people are not aware of the slippery slope. They're not aware of the 1 foot in front of the journey of 1,000 miles that begins with a single step. And they think that we're getting away from God. Yeah, good thing too. Yes?
Do you think that we should remove tax exemptions for religious institutions?
Absolutely. It's never going to happen, but do I believe it? Absolutely. I think that churches ought to be taxed for every nickel they collect.
I think they're just businesses.
They are businesses. They are businesses. Why do we have why do churches, why does the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese of New York, own literally billions of dollars worth of real estate in New York that they don't pay taxes on?
Right.
It just makes no sense at all. Carrie.
I'm recalling the national televised debate between George Bush, candidate, and John Kerry. And I'm recalling the statement directly from the Constitution that there shall never be a religious test for any office in the United States. And during that debate, George W. Bush said that he would hold as a test for candidates for the Supreme Court that they believe in God. And I don't recall any notice in the press or any editorial anywhere that I'm aware of that said that what he was proposing was against the Constitution.
Right. Yeah.
And what can we do about that kind of situation?
Yeah. Well, of course, what Bush was saying was, as president, I'm not going to nominate somebody who doesn't believe in God, which is not against the law. He can nominate whoever the hell he wants, and he can use whatever standards. But, well, I take it back, because he would be acting in his official capacity, wouldn't he? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He would be acting in his, he can't do that. You can't do it. But in fact, he did. In fact, he did. Sir, back there.
Yes, I was wondering, don't you think that the 5-vote conservative majority on the Supreme Court is a distinct danger to the concept?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it is. I worry about Scalia. I worry about worry what's coming up. The few new tests. Yes, I do. I worry about it a great deal. Will it swing back the other way? Yeah, it will. There's an article in the New Yorker of last week or the week before about Obama's judicial legacy. He first of all, he has appointed 2 people to the Supreme Court. Okay. He has appointed over 80 people to circuit courts and appeals courts. He's very quietly, we haven't noticed it, he's very quietly shaped the courts for decades to come. And we didn't even recognize it.
And have they been okay?
Yes. They're all sitting now. They've been,
I mean, he's asking the quality.
huh? They were appointed by Obama. They are basically, they're not, really terribly liberal or progressive as is it Ryan Lizza? I forget. It's in the very recent New Yorker, last couple of weeks.
He's being a Johnny
Might be
Appleseed.
Tubin, might be Jeffrey Tubin who wrote it. I'm sorry.
Being a Johnny Appleseed.
Yeah, sort of. Okay. They are centrist left. Being Obama. Great disappointment. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I want to, as far as the article in the Constitution prohibiting God being, having, I believe there are 8 states where you do need to pledge allegiance or to swear your allegiance to God. In order
There
to
are
hold
several
office.
states where it is
Several states.
where atheism, you're not allowed to hold public office as an atheist. Those are all unconstitutional. And
They do
they
exist.
get challenged. They're just sitting on the books, and atheists run for office and don't say I'm an atheist. And then, as someone will come along, as Herb Silverstein did in Maryland a few years ago, he ran for the person who now he's running, the person who stamps your the notary public, which is a government office, and he challenged, and of course the state folded. I mean, they couldn't support it. But so these things, yeah, they're all going down one by one. Remember Star? Anybody remember Star Jones? This is a woman who's a lawyer, and she gained fame because she was she was around at the O.J. Simpson trial, and they were consulting with her and fine, and so suddenly she was on all kinds of programs, and she was on the early version of the View, and this is a woman who is a lawyer, and she said flat out that no atheist could be president because they would not be able to swear the presidential oath, which she didn't know. And the sad part of it is the 4 other women on that panel, nobody said a word. It just went right over everybody's head. Nobody knew. Sir.
Would that not be why the gentlemen, the comparatively few who wrote the Constitution, put in this thing about church and state? Because they saw the common man being much more religious.
I wonder.
Put
I
in
don't
this
know.
petty
I wonder. What they did know,
Yeah.
what they did know was that many of them, their own grandfathers and great-grandfathers came to these shores because of the religious wars in England, and they wanted no truck with that. They just didn't want it. They knew what they knew what had happened. Were they afraid of the common man? They may have been. And my personal guess, as an amateur in this business in this history, my personal guess is they didn't see it coming.
Yeah.
They didn't. Jason.
Yeah, regarding the concern that you started the presentation off with, which by the way I thought was fabulous in the
Thank you.
presentation. Historical accuracy logic typically has zero impact on the nation as a whole,
Right.
and a more frontal assault on this attack on the Constitution is going to be required. So is who's leading the charge? Is there a charge?
No, the right wing and the religionists have the edge right now, and it's because they're disciplined, because they are on message, because I don't mean to make it Republican Democrat, but you know, the Republicans get their marching orders every Friday afternoon. They still do, which Newt Gingrich set up with the revolution, the so-called contract with America in 1994. And that's why you see when anything goes wrong, when anything comes up, they all come up in front of the microphones and they all use the exact same words. Because Gingrich and his Joseph Goebbels, Fred once, they said it this way: this is what you will do. They are disciplined, and the religionists, the right wing, the fundamentalists, learned a lesson from them. They talk to each other. Catholic Church and fundamentalist Protestants, they talk to each other all the time. They coordinate their efforts. I mean, this is, when I was a little kid, being brought up in a vaguely Catholic family, they really didn't give a damn. But, I mean, I was taught, Protestants are all going to burn in hell. They're all going to burn in hell. Today, the right-wing Catholics and the right-wing Protestants all work together, and they do the same thing. They come out with the exact same words. They work on the same issues. They fight together, and those of us on our side, we sort of, you know, like, well, if we think good thoughts and we try to be nice people, they'll come around to our point of thinking. No, they won't. Yes, ma'am.
I think that, you know, more to the point, the ACLU has been right out there, out front.
Yes, that's what it's for.
Protecting the right of the separation of church and state.
Good point. I'm a member of the ACLU. Who else? You should all. There's a question. There, Jason. There's the point. Everybody join the ACLU. Give them your dues every year. I have been an ACLU member for over 30 years, and I think you all should be.
Also, Americans United for Separation of
Church and state. If you've got a few bucks more, join that one too. And okay, good. I'm also a member.
On that note, can we please say thank you to John Rafferty?
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. And I am delighted by the turnout. Thank you all for being, I know you didn't come for me. You came because of this. But I'm so glad you're here. Thank you. They made it worth coming here. Okay.